What if I told you that all of American history is just one big Epstein file? Let me explain. Over the past few weeks, many people have been shocked and sickened by the details coming out of the Epstein files. These files show how for decades, elites from around the world have been involved in the rape, torture, and abuse of women and children. And because of their financial status, none of these criminals have faced any real consequences. Even though I'm just as disgusted as everyone else at this information, I can't say that I'm shocked. In fact, I would argue that what Epstein and others were doing is exactly what rich and powerful white men have been doing in America from the very beginning. I would even go as far as to say that the Epstein files are as American as apple pie. These files are the true face of American exceptionalism. It has always been exceptionally evil. For example, one thing we know about Epstein is that he was involved in the sex trafficking and abuse of young girls. And this is something that goes back to the arrival of Christopher Columbus in the Americas in 1492. In his diary, Columbus described how his men frequently kidnapped and sold indigenous women into sexual slavery. He wrote that the sex slave trade is very common, and there are now many merchants who go about looking for girls. Some of 9 or 10 are now on sale, but whatever their age, they command a good price. We know that the men who traveled with Columbus constantly assaulted indigenous women. A man traveling with Columbus described how, while I was in the boat, I captured a very beautiful Carib woman, whom the Lord Admiral gave to me. When I had taken her to my cabin, she was naked, as was their custom. I was filled with a desire to take my pleasure with her, and attempted to satisfy my desire. She was unwilling, and so treated me with her nails that I wished I had never begun. But, to cut a long story short, I then took a piece of rope and whipped her soundly, and she let forth such incredible screams that you would not have believed your ears. Eventually, we came to such terms, I assure you, that you would have thought that she had been brought up in a school for whores. Everything disgusting and horrifying that you'll find in the Epstein files was considered normal behavior for Europeans and Americans during the age of slavery. European slave ship captains and crew started raping enslaved Africans the moment they brought them aboard their ships. In 1754, a British slave ship captain named John Newton witnessed the rape of an enslaved black woman, who he simply called number 83. He wrote that, crew member William Cooney seduced her down into the room and lay with her brute-like in view of the whole quarterdeck. Is it really any surprise that rich and powerful men like Epstein were sadistic monsters and serial abusers of women and children, when that is exactly what the rich slave-owning class had been doing since the founding of this country? Thomas Jefferson, the man who declared that all men are created equal, was a pedophile who raped the enslaved teenager that he owned named Sally Hemings. Doctors like J. Marion Sims and Ephraim McDowell purchased enslaved black women and experimented on their bodies with no anesthesia. When enslaved black women and girls arrived in America, they were often sold into sexual slavery in what was called the fancy girl trade. And in this respect, every American plantation was its own little Epstein Island. An American slave trader in the 1800s wrote that there is a great demand for fancy maids, such as a fancy girl named Alice that he sold into sexual slavery for $800. A reporter in New Orleans went to one of these fancy girl auctions, and he said that on the auction block was one of the most beautiful women I had ever seen. She was about 16, dressed in a cheap striped woolen gown and bareheaded. Her name was Hermina, and she was sold for around $1,200, which is over $35,000 today. The reporter said that the man she was sold to was one of the most lecherous brutes I ever set eyes on. Many enslavers looked at the women they purchased like Epstein looked at minors, with Epstein saying that young girls are like shrimp. You throw away the head and keep the body. Like Epstein, many white enslavers purchased young girls so they could rape them whenever they wanted. For example, in 1850, a Missouri farmer named Robert Newsom purchased a fancy girl named Celia, who was only 14 years old. Newsom raped her for 5 years, but finally in 1855, Celia had had enough. When Newsom came to rape her as usual, Celia beat him over the head with a stick and killed him. Then she burned his body in the fireplace. When she was put on trial, enslaved black women were not allowed to argue self-defense, so she was charged with murder, and an all-white jury sentenced her to death. So on December 21st, 1855, she was executed by hanging outside of the courthouse. Enslavers who raped the women that they owned were never punished for their crimes, because it wasn't seen as a crime to rape your own property. Another example is James Henry Hammond. Hammond was a slave owner from South Carolina who purchased a black girl named Sally Johnson and began raping her when she was 18. Because of these rapes, Sally had several of Hammond's children. One of those children was named Louisa, and when she turned 12, Hammond started raping her. Hammond kept a diary called Secret and Sacred, in which he described how he raped his slaves, and also how he raped 4 of his nieces, who were all teenagers. The title of Hammond's rape diary reminds me of Trump's birthday letter to Epstein, where he said, "May every day be another wonderful secret." But neither Epstein's nor Hammond's crimes remained secrets for long. The story of Hammond raping his nieces went public in the 1850s, which caused a major scandal because at the time he was the governor of South Carolina. But even though it was now public knowledge that Hammond was a serial rapist of his slaves and of his own family members, that did not stop him from being elected a U.S. Senator in 1857. If you think that the torture and violence in the Epstein files is shocking or unique, then you've probably never learned what white enslavers did to black people for centuries. Slave ship captains would frequently feed enslaved people to sharks as a form of terrorism to keep everyone else in line. In one case, a slave ship crew cut out the heart of a rebellious slave and forced the other enslaved people on board to eat it. When Nat Turner was executed after his failed rebellion in 1831, his skin was stripped off of his body and cut up into tiny purses to be sold as souvenirs. His bones and skull were sold to the highest bidder, and his flesh and fat was boiled down to make grease. During lynchings, white people would cut off their victims' testicles for fun. Then they'd cut off their ears, toes, fingers, and hair to keep at their house as souvenirs. Knowing that all of this happened in this country for centuries, are you really surprised by anything in the Epstein files? Men, women, and children have always been raped, abused, tortured, and murdered for the pleasure of white people. And usually it has been the rich who have been most involved and the least likely to be punished. When you know the truth about American history, you realize that the Epstein files are just a continuation of what's always been going on. Epstein is America, and America is Epstein. This is what white supremacy is. It's a system of violence, torture, and abuse. This is what capitalism produces, a sadistic elite who can get away with anything, including murder. This kind of behavior will always be with us, as long as white supremacy and capitalism are allowed to flourish and corrupt everything they touch.